G'day. So I'm reacting today to Paul Kingsnorth's lecture, First Things Lecture, and I'm reacting to his critique of Christian civilization. And I think his critique is provocative and interesting, but we don't need to be alarmed. So I think there's some merit to the critique, but I also don't think we need to be alarmed by that. So I'm saying this, and then I'll go into more detail into why I think this. I'm saying this because we participate as individuals. We don't need to be alarmed by this critique because we participate as individuals in God's global story, God's global history. And in some ways, we both participate in God's global history, but it also happens to us. And so that local participation, individual participation, and the way in which the story happens to us is the basis for not being alarmed by Paul Kingsnorth's critique. And I'm also, I think there's merit to Paul's critique. I should probably call him Kingsnorth because that's been the pattern so far. So we don't confuse him with Paul van der Clay. But I think there's merit to Kingsnorth's critique because there's the danger that we imperial-ise Christianity. And that danger is at a local level, at a small scale. While it might be observed at larger levels, the merit to the critique, the danger, the critique that we need to take on board is in that aspect, the imperialization of Christianity. So I thought it'd be worth thinking first, or reacting first, or playing first a couple of clips. I think I'll play 3 clips from Kingsnorth's lecture. And I want to I'm picking these clips for particular reasons. The first is, what does he mean by Christian? And then I want to pick a clip from about halfway point by, what does he mean by civilization? And then another clip about critique. So let me, I'll drop them in now. The first one will be at the 18-minute mark. What does he mean by Christian?
The question that logically arises from that observation is the decline of Christianity responsible for our current malaise? Is our lack of faith at the root of our loss of confidence and the ensuing inversion of our old values? And the answer to this, in one sense, is obviously yes. As another historian, Tom Holland, demonstrated in his book Dominion, it was Christianity which formed the Western mind. When such a sacred order dies, there will be upheaval at every level of society, from the level of politics right down to the level of the soul. And this, I think, is where we are. I'm hardly the only one to have noticed. In fact, almost everyone who is paying attention has by now noticed. Some of those people, in response, have come to a conclusion that since Christianity was the basis of this Western culture of ours, and since this culture is now sick or even dying, the way to revive it must be to revive Christianity. Not so much as a faith, but rather as a social glue, or even as a weapon. What we need, we increasingly hear from many different quarters, is a return to something called Christian civilization, regardless of whether the Christian faith is in fact true. At a certain level, this might appear to be a superficially attractive narrative, but I think it's a deadly mistake. I'm going to attempt here to explain why.
And now this next clip will be about civilization. What does he mean by civilization?
So it might be at this point worth asking what a civilization actually is. It's generally defined as a way of living based around the civitas, the city. Like most people, at most times, we probably assume that our way of life is normative and will persist. But it is worth noting that for 99% of human history, we have not been civilized at all. For most of that time, in fact, we were closer in our lifestyles to the picture painted of the Garden of Eden, where, remember, we were soil plus the breath of God. The word Adam, as I'm sure many of you know, is a pun on the Hebrew word Adama, which means soil. And the word humus, meaning the matter of soil, has the same etymology as humility, which Christ tells us is the way home. Only in the last 10,000 years, in selective regions of the planet, has any urban way of life constructed around settled agriculture, cities, states, and economies of accumulation and surplus arisen. Only in the last 100 years has this model gone global. Really, only in this century have we seen the globalization of the technological society. And given the speed at which this has happened, and given the record of past civilizations, all of which, of course, as Toynbee reminded us, have collapsed, there's no guarantee that this will continue into the future, however much we may assume that it will. And when we look at the results of the growth of civilization over that period of time, we would have to say, if we were being honest, that the verdict was mixed. In the red column, we can see that the spread of human civilization has ravaged God's creation in an unprecedented fashion. Remember, we are made to be gardeners, to tend and keep the creation, which God saw was good. How have we done on that? We've changed the climate. We've killed half of the forests. We're in the 6th mass extinction in the world's history. The earth, the sea is full of plastic. So are our bodies. And those are just the achievements of the last 50 years. That's not to mention the vast inequalities of wealth and the warfare on a previously unimaginable scale, the nuclear weapons, the march of artificial intelligence. Now, in the black column, on the other hand, we can see that civilization has created wealth and technologies in quantities previously unimaginable, even as it's allowed us to visit the moon and extend our lifespans. Although, according to anthropologists, we've only managed to extend them back to the length which the pre-civilized hunter-gatherers were enjoying before the invention of agriculture, which reduced our stature and our lifespans for a long period of time. I suppose we could debate the pros and cons of civilization all night, but what does this have to do with the Christian way?
And then this clip will be sort of drawing those threads together and thinking about or seeing how he describes this critique.
With a God who made us to inhabit this garden in communion with all life. A God who walked among us as a poor man, preaching renunciation and love. And what actually is spiritually beneficial about this Western civilization, or any civilization? Babylon and Babel, Sodom and Gomorrah were, after all, as civilized as the ancient world God. To find out, I thought we could hold up the stated values of our civilization against the famous list of deadly sins compiled by the Western Church. The compilation of the 7 deadly sins was put together in the 6th century by Pope Gregory I. He based it on an earlier list of 8 passions, compiled by the 4th century monk Evagrius Ponticus, which is still current in the Eastern Church. So how well is Western civilization doing at fending off these sins? Well, pride is celebrated everywhere. There's a sentence with a double meaning. Everywhere. Pride in nation, pride in status, wealth, ethnic group, identity, religion, and of course now we have a month-long festival named for it. Greed. Greed is the basis for our economy. Along with envy, it's the cornerstone of the idol of our time, the universally worshipped God known as economic growth. If we were neither greedy nor envious, the economy would collapse in 5 minutes. Wrath is the fuel beneath the culture wars and all of our political factions. And as for lust, find me a billboard or a film or a song or a brand of shoes which doesn't piggyback on this most primal human passion to sell itself. It's perhaps just one ahead of gluttony in its ubiquity. Even sloth has been monetized. How else could something as oxymoronic as a leisure industry even exist? Our entire civilization then not only fails to resist these deadly sins, but actively encourages and monetizes them. They are the very basis of its existence. This surely is what Ohiyesa and many other critics, many of them Christians, are able to see. Are Christianity and modern civilization opposed and irreconcilable, as Ohiyesa claimed? On that basis, I think we can unequivocally say yes. But we could go further than this as well. Because it's not just modern civilization, as Ohiyesa wrote, or indeed Western civilization, which seems opposed to the Christian way, it's all civilization. After all, the very foundation of an urban society based around agriculture, with wealth and power concentrated in kings and armies, is what Christ called heaping your wealth into barns. And we know what he thought of that. And when we read the life of Jesus of Nazareth, actually, it's impossible not to see a man who, in some fundamental sense, was uncivilized. He didn't tell us to get good jobs and save prudently. He told us to have no thought for the morrow. He didn't tell us to generate wealth so that economic growth could bring about global development. He told us to give everything away. The rich, he said repeatedly, could never attain the kingdom of heaven. He didn't tell us to defend our frontiers or expand them. He told us never to resist evil. He didn't tell us to be responsible citizens. He told us to leave our dead fathers unburied and follow him instead. He told us to hate our own parents and love those who hated us. Every single one of these teachings, were we to follow them, would make the building of a civilization an impossibility. So what we're really hearing about then when we hear talk of defending or rebuilding Christian civilization is not Christianity and its teachings at all, but modernity and its end game. It's the idol of material progress, the progress which has shredded both culture and nature, which is causing such grief everywhere. And Christian civilization is not a solution to this. It's a problem which is part of it. And when actual Christianity is proposed instead, the response is so often the same. Oh yes, that's all very well, you fundamentalist, but what practical use is that? And the answer surely is none. Christianity is impractical. It's impractical, it's intolerable, and it's awful in the original sense of that word. It's terrifying, and it's designed to kill you. And this is because the values of God and the world are inimical, as we are repeatedly told by Christ and all the saints. And this, it seems to me, is the beautiful mystery at the heart of the thing. God is not mocked. His wisdom is foolishness to the world, and vice versa.
Now the whole lectures and the question time afterwards is worth listening to and thinking about. A quick tangent. I'm focusing on the topics of civilization, particularly Christian civilization, that sort of idea, Paul's critique, and then responding to that, commenting on that aspect. But I think there's an important tangent here, and that is that I want to park the problem of the current problem of modernity, sometimes described as the meaning crisis. I want to kind of park that because that's an obvious critique of our current situation. And Paul Kingsnorth is focusing on the Christian civilization aspect, but it'd be worth just quickly tangenting and commenting on and parking this problem and returning to it later. And that is the problem of the ascendancy of atheism and the accompanying the accompanying moral and meaning problems around it. So the moral problems are magnified by the ascendancy of atheism. And I think it's, what did I write down here? Yeah, it's the moral problem is the dominance of decadence. So the ascendancy of atheism has created the dominance of decadence, and Paul Kingsnorth comments on that in this video. And also at the same time, the ascendancy of atheism has emphasized the view from nowhere. So there's a sort of a moral problem and a meaning problem. The meaning problem you could describe as the view from nowhere. So the view from nowhere is assumed, and all of civilization, all of existence is perceived from this, what was previously a divine viewpoint. And so in the absence of God, how are we viewing everything? How does that work in an atheistic framework? And that double dilemma of atheism, that the ascendancy of atheism has created for our current culture is worth thinking about. It comes up, it's a thread, it's a theme of Kingsnorth's lecture, but it's worth thinking about in another video. So thinking about this idea of Christian civilization. And I want to say that to begin with, the beginning of why we shouldn't be alarmed by this critique, by Kingsnorth's critique, is what I'm calling a hardware-software distinction. I should probably do it like this. So the software running at this level, and then underneath you have hardware. So you have sort of things built in to the actual substance and structure of existence, and then you have systems running on top of that, programs running on top of that. So I'm using this as an allegory for thinking about the way in which we should think about civilization. So I'll play a quick clip of this hardware-software distinction just to emphasize the distinction. And then I want to point out a couple of things about that.
Hardware is any element of a computer that's physical. This includes things like monitors, keyboards, and also the insides of devices like microchips and hard drives. Software is anything that tells hardware what to do and how to do it, including computer programs and apps on your phone. So video games, photo editors, and web browsers are just a few examples. Hardware and software are very different from each other, but they also need one another in order to function.
So the first thing to point out is that, in a sense, it's incidental. So the perceived Christian structure to civilization is incidental to us. It's deliberate. It's deliberate and I'm going to make this argument in just a moment, because God's global history is authored by God, but it's incidental in that it's not a deliberate human project. We'll get to the human project part in just a moment when I talk about the software level. But if another way of putting this is natural law, and Aquinas is famously known for popularizing this concept of natural law, and I'll play a quick clip about that now.
This eternal law, this plan of God, is imprinted in rational creatures, like human beings, in a special way, and Aquinas calls this the natural law. He says that the natural law is the rational creature's participation in the eternal law. What does that mean? We are capable of understanding the world around us, grasping with our minds what is good for us to do, and moving ourselves to do it according to this rational desire, which we call our will. That means that we have a higher participation in God's providential plan than other creatures do, because we can understand it and become willing agents in bringing it to completion for ourselves, for others, and for our communities. Let's unpack this. Like other lower creatures, we have certain inclinations or tendencies that are natural to us. They're a part of our natures, features of the kind of creatures we are. The natures of inanimate things, of plants, of animals, entirely determine their movements. A stone goes down. A tree flowers in the spring. A cow eats grass. These actions are natural to these kinds of things. Human beings are like these things in a certain way. We're creatures with material bodies, and so, like other animals, we have an inclination to remain in being, to seek food and self-preservation, to reproduce and to raise offspring. Yet, unlike these creatures, we are endowed with the power of reason, which means that we're not simply moved by brute force or instinct. We have something higher, a spiritual soul, which gives our nature a spiritual dimension. Now, on this point, there's often a very deep misunderstanding. Our spiritual nature is the basis for our ability to understand and to make free choices. It gives us a higher perspective on our lower or bodily inclinations and desires, so that, for example, we can decide at a particular moment that we will not eat right now, even though we're hungry. But here's the key point. Our spiritual nature is not opposed to our natural inclinations. In fact, it also has its own natural inclinations. And these inclinations, which belong to us because of the spiritual dimension of the human person, don't determine our movements and actions, but rather they're the source and the cause of them. Our spiritual nature lies at the root of our freedom and gives it its vital energy. Consider what we mean when we say, I'm thirsting for the truth. We're using an analogy. We all know what it's like to be thirsty. A biological inclination like this sometimes directs our appetite in a very compelling way. But is thirst contrary to our freedom? No. It's in eating and drinking that we have the physical strength to do all the other things that we do. Is our thirst for the truth an obstacle or limit to our freedom? Well, obviously not. What we're trying to express is actually the root of our free desire to know the truth. And anyone who's ever been drawn to a particular subject and who thirsts to know more about it realizes that this thirst, this love for the subject, doesn't decrease freedom, but actually is the root of our free activity by which we learn more and more about what we love. In other words, our spiritual inclinations are real. They're really a part of our spiritual nature, and they're not blind determinations that limit our freedom. Rather, they're its very source, and they spur it on. Let's now return to the idea of the eternal law. Aquinas teaches that God has imprinted in creatures their inclinations to their proper acts and ends in accordance with God's eternal plan, and likewise that he's imprinted these inclinations in human beings in a higher way. We have inclinations that belong to us in virtue of our spiritual nature. We're now in a better position to understand what Aquinas means by his famous claim that the precepts of the natural law follow the order of our natural inclinations. He means that as we understand the inclinations of our spiritual nature, we come to grasp what God made a human being to be and what human life is ordered to. And so we come to know what a human being ought to do and avoid. St. Thomas lists 5 principal natural inclinations: the inclination to the good, that is, to what perfects us; the inclination to self-preservation, for example, to seek food, shelter, clothing, to avoid threats to our life; the inclination to sexual union and the upbringing of offspring; the inclination to knowing the truth; and the inclination to living in society, which includes the inclination to friendship and to justice and fairness towards others. Of course, some people might sometimes act contrary to one or another of these inclinations, and there's always the possibility that due to sin, our desires will become distorted. But Aquinas thinks that these 5 inclinations really are features of the kind of beings that we are, and that they give us a fundamental orientation towards what will make us increasingly happy and increasingly free. It's important to see that for St. Thomas, natural law is thus not imposed on us by some alien will that commands us from above. It's rather the very design of our being. As we come to know this with our minds, we're then able to participate intentionally and freely in this plan. We order ourselves, our actions, beings lower than us, and even our communities according to this plan by the use of our freedom. This is, in an important sense, the very purpose of our freedom, that we would be the creatures that order ourselves freely and knowingly to God according to his plan.
And so that idea of morality and pattern and order, the reason that the universe makes sense and the reason that people throughout history and all times and places have a sense of values is because it's built into people's hardware. That's how we organize ourselves. That's how we value things. And C.S. Lewis makes this point that even if you find some tribe somewhere that values stealing, it's an unusual exception. It's a notable can't even say that word properly. It's if you discover it through ethnography, this unusual tribe, then that's the exception. It doesn't mean that suddenly this underlying concept of natural law is debunked because you have this one exception. It's because they're the exception. There's some sort of circumstance that has altered that underlying sense of right and wrong, that underlying sense that taking something is wrong. Now, so that's the sort of the broadly what I mean by hardware, but perhaps more specifically thinking of Romans 1:20. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, been understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. And that's at the beginning of the book of Romans, where it's sort of making the case for the human condition, the problem of the human condition. And the verse that I've just read out kind of highlights that there's this deep hardware in humans, this sense of the existence of God and the existence of morality, and the universe makes sense. There are patterns and structure. God has arranged the world in a particular way. Now, there might be, the problem of human condition, and things are broken and people are corrupt, but you can still see through a glass darkly how the world should roughly work. And in a sense, when we say civilization, just civilization as a term by itself, just pause the Christian aspect for a moment. We mean this human tendency to organize ourselves in a particular way, and this human tendency to have a particular set of values. Even if there's regional variation, and even if there's different ways of explaining it, there's this sort of inbuilt human tendency. And you can see this in just a video from the Kirkazat channel, which talks about what is civilization. So I'll play most of that video now. Just, by the way, a quick tangent. I sort of have a love-hate relationship with the Kirkazat channel. I like that they cover so many topics and sort of do these sort of short explainer videos, and that aspect is good and fun. But I don't like how they I guess it's good that they've got this sort of objective skepticism. That's the approach they attempt to take, but they fall into that trap of the view from nowhere. So there's this sort of there's this unacknowledged, in that video, in the clip that I just played, there's a sort of unacknowledged moral assessment on what is healthy, good civilization. How can we make that assessment? Why do we make that assessment? What's the basis for making that assessment? And Kirkazat doesn't acknowledge that in an effort to be objective, yet how can you make that? How can you make any moral assessment if you don't talk about it? It's this sort of unexamined view from nowhere. That's just my little beef with Kirkazat, but I think the main idea of that clip stands, and that is that humans produce civilization. Humans organize themselves naturally, and that natural organization, that natural sense of values, is our hardwired sense of civilization. And in a way, if that's what... So Kingsnorth sort of paints a very broad brush and contrasts sort of more primitive human behavior with civilization behavior. But that's not really alarming, because that's what humans do. Humans are hardwired to create civilizations. And so there's nothing we can do about that. That's a hardwired dimension of humans. Now, it may be broken and corrupted for sure, and Kingsnorth highlights that as well, but we're not to be alarmed by the fact of civilization and humans doing civilization. But then there's also a software level. There's a hardware level, so humans everywhere make civilizations. And then there's a sort of a software level. Well, there's a particular variant called Christian civilization or Western civilization. And it's worth teasing out the distinction a little bit there as well. And I might play a clip, and this is just a clip that I found of Tom Holland, because he's often talking about the way in which Christianity, the rise of Christianity shaped modern culture, particularly the values of modern culture. And so, he's written that book Dominion. I'll put the cover up here. And so I've just picked a clip that the algorithm provided of Tom Holland talking about the role of Christianity in civilization.
what happened? What explains the kind of evolution of thought that means that now, rather than praising the Spartans for chucking babies who may not measure up to their standards of citizenship down a ravine, we're now appalled by that? Why now do we go to such efforts to keep young children, when they're born, maybe on life support? You know, what explains this vast process of change? I mean, that's just one example. But in almost every way, the resemblance between, say, the Roman world and ours, they are faux amis. They may seem to be similar, but in the more you look at them, the more you realize how different they are, how alien, how strange. And that's even on the most fundamental level, so things like sexuality, things like that. So over the process of the past few years, I've been recalibrating exactly where it is that I morally, ethically, culturally come from, and essentially where the whole of Western society comes from. And I've come to the conclusion, rather like someone looking, you know, can't quite identify an itch on the back, and then you find it and it's really great when you scratch it. I've come to the conclusion that essentially I am Christian. I am not classically Greek or Roman. I am essentially Christian, and I think that you are, even though you might deny that. I think the whole of the society, Western society that we've grown up is. And I think essentially we are all goldfish, and the water in which we are swimming is Christian, which is not to say that we all are confessional Christians. We may not believe that the Lord Jesus Christ rose on the third day. But if we think of Christianity as a kind of civilization, a matrix, a way of seeing and understanding the world, and one above all that has grounded kind of revolutionary concepts like progress, reformatio, revolution at its heart, then we can see how the very fact that the past 2,000 years of Western history have been so unstable, the fact that it has changed so much, is also tribute to the fact about something that hasn't changed, which is that the impulses and the well springs of this process derive from the one source, which I think is Christianity. So that essentially is the argument of the book.
But it's not just that that's the only program running, the only piece of software running sort of in parallel and sometimes complementing and sometimes at odds with that sort of idea of a Christian civilization is their idea of a Western civilization. And so I'll play a clip. Again, Roger Scruton's known for talking about Western civilization, defending Western civilization. And so here's a clip of him talking about Western civilization. And in it, you'll see the distinction a little bit between sort of Western civilization more broadly and how it interfaces with Christian civilization.
Western civilization has come in for a lot of attack because it's Western. The word Western has been taken to be a standard term of abuse by so many people in the world today, and in particular by people who don't have the faintest idea what it means historically, metaphysically, or poetically. Our Western civilization is not some peculiar, narrow little obsession of people who happen to live in a certain geographical part of the world. It is an inheritance, constantly expanding, constantly including new things, something which has given us the knowledge of the human heart, which has enabled us to produce not just our wonderful economies and the wonderful ways of living in the world that are ours, but also the great works of art, the religions, the systems of law and government, all the other things which make it actually possible for us to recognize that we live in this world, insofar as possible, successfully. Let's leave aside the idea of Western civilization. After all, it depends which way you're going around the globe, whether it's west or east. Look instead at the idea of civilization. What is it? What is a civilization? It is surely a form of connection between people, a way in which people understand not just their languages, their customs, their forms of behaviour, but the way in which they connect to each other eye to eye, face to face, in the day-to-day life which they share. This is something which has ordinary dimensions in the workplace and in the community, in our day-to-day making do with things, but also it has a high culture built upon it, works of art, literature, music, architecture and so on, ways of changing the world so as to be more at home in it. And I think that is the distinctive feature of Western civilization, that it is a comprehensive civilization, constantly giving us new ways of being at home, ways of being in relation to each other which bring peace and interest as the primary bonds between our neighbours. Now, I myself have obviously got into an awful lot of trouble through defending Western civilization, and it seems a strange feature of our times that the more you are disposed to defend it, the more you are regarded as some kind of narrow-minded bigot. But the people who make that accusation are the real ones with the narrow mind. They're people who do not see exactly how large and comprehensive our civilization has been and still is. We were brought up on, for example, the Hebrew Bible, an ancient document which perpetuates the civilization of the pre-classical Middle East, gives us a sense of what people are like in tribal communities when wandering through deserts and so on. We learned and studied the great epics of Rome and Greece, which taught us different languages, dead languages, but languages which showed the world in a different light from our own languages today. We were brought up again on the literature of the Middle Ages, much of it influenced by Arabian literature, of course. Indeed, we all were put to bed with bedtime stories from the Arabian Nights. The further you look into it, the more comprehensive and universal do you see the inheritance of our civilization to be. And that is something that we tend to forget today. It isn't a narrow bequest. It is something which actually is open to all kinds of innovation, which accepts the whole of human being as its subject matter.
And so that's probably another video to talk about those two parallel programs and the way in which they complement and sometimes are at odds. But there's a big overlap. The computer doesn't crash when both are running at the same time, when Western civilization and Christian civilization are running at the same time. Sometimes it runs into, to keep going with this allegory, sometimes there's problems that are created when you're running these two programs at the same time, but most of the time it works. Those two programs work together. But that interaction is worth teasing out in another video. I want to focus, though, on Christian civilization because that's where Kingsnorth is focusing. He's focusing on that particular aspect, even though it's worth seeing that we've got both programs, Christian civilization and Western civilization, running at the same time. But Kingsnorth is focusing on Christian civilization. That's the problem. Christian civilization, as you saw in that previous clip, is a problem. And so just to think about Christian civilization and to emphasize its goodness for a moment, I'll put a link down below and a copy of the cover up here of, I've got to say his name properly, Vishnal Maglawadi's book about the way in which the Bible shapes our civilization, and particularly the value system, but also the way in which we perceive meaning and describe the meaning of our world. And that's worth thinking about and seeing that Christianity has had an important impact on the civilization software that's running. Now, it's worth also then thinking about the problem of imperializing, that interacting with Kingsnorth's critique. So you've got this particular type of civilization software running, and it hasn't always been great. There have been, problems. I tangented the problem of the ascendancy of atheism. How did that occur if we've got this Christian Civilization program running and the Western Civilization program running as well? What has been the cause? And another little sidebar, I think the Industrial Revolution, I was convinced by Bulwarks of Unbelief, and I'll put the cover up here. And I think I agree with that thesis that the Industrial Revolution changed the way we perceive our world, the way we think about agency, and the way we think about God. And instead of thinking about the God who authors and communicates, we think about the God who is absent. We've sort of changed our perception of God. And so that's made atheism more plausible, and therefore caused the current situation that we're in. But it's worth thinking about Christian civilization has been sort of running, that program, that software's been running while all of this rise of atheism has been taking place, and creating and Christian civilization, a form of it's running at the moment in the midst of, as I just said earlier, sort of the dominance of decadence and the view from nowhere, those two problems. So Christian civilization hasn't helped with those things, and maybe it's contributed to them, or maybe not. That's the sort of sharp end of the critique, Kingsnorth critique, that I now want to think about. And just to, before I agree with him, where I disagree with him, and why I said at the beginning I'm not alarmed, and why I don't think you should be alarmed, is that Christian civilization in some senses is outside of our control. So Christian civilization, so that in the hardware level is outside our control because we're creatures, and the Creator has created us in a particular way. But also the software, in a sense, is at scale, at a large scale, outside of our control. And that's because we participate at an individual level, and the big themes of God's global history happen to us. There's very little we can do beyond our local sphere. We can observe, but there's very little we can do to shape what happens to us. So in a way, the fact that one of the programs running at the moment is Christian civilization is above our pay grade. It's the theme that the author has written in and allowed to take place. And I might just play a quick clip from an Australian pastor talking about Rodney Stark's book, and he's a historian and sociologist thinking about the rise of Christianity and the way in which, like Tom Holland's thesis, but in particular sort of focusing on how the increasing number of Christians in the first few centuries shaped society. So it wasn't any individual Christian kind of making decisions. You can't just pin it all on Constantine's vision at the bridge and his sort of high-level executive decisions, although that's a factor. That's something to consider, but it's not the full story. It's not an explanation that explains everything. A better explanation is that it happens to us, and therefore it's not alarming. But let's play that Rodney Stark clip now, just to give you a sense of the Christian civilization occurring at a larger than individual sphere.
What the author of this book does is he says, well, how did the church grow in the ancient world? And he doesn't approach it as a Christian. He approaches it as a sociologist of religion. That's his job. He's a professor, he's a sociologist. He studies people and communities and how they function. Just as an interesting aside, I did hear, or I read, I think, that Rodney Stark came to Christian faith as a result of writing this book and as a result of some of the things he discovered. But he's not approaching this in any way as a Christian. What he's doing is trying to answer a historical question. And that question is the subtitle of the book. How did an obscure, marginal Jesus movement become the dominant religious force in the Western world in a few centuries? I mean, it is incredible when you think about it. Not particularly educated, not large numbers, their leader recently crucified, and yet the early church went from this small, beleaguered and persecuted group to one that grew so rapidly that it became very popular after a few years to join them. If you weren't a Christian, you didn't feel like you were part of the in crowd. How did it get to that point? Well, he answers this by looking at a whole bunch of different things, but his fundamental answer is that the guiding or the common thread through all of the different aspects of this story is a thing called virtue, a way of life that was present in these communities that was quite different from the way of life on offer in society at large. The Christians had a virtue, a sense of who they were in the world, what life was all about, a sense of hope after death, a sense of living in a way that affirmed human dignity that made it a very attractive movement for many, many people in the ancient world. Now, he looks at this issue of virtue by looking at a bunch of different aspects, and the chapters are broken up around these different themes that he explores. Interestingly, one of those themes is to do with epidemics and plagues. Really interesting story there. Plagues would sweep through the ancient world, particularly in cities which were pretty much petri dishes with humans in them, very infectious places. And when plague would arrive, if you had the ability to get out of town, that's what you did. The people who stayed were those who were already sick or those who couldn't leave for whatever reason. Then this other group of people decided that they would stay. And it became the norm for Christian leaders and bishops and other Christians to stay in the town when the plague arrived. They didn't do that out of some cunning plan to grow the church. Quite the opposite. They expected it to shrink the church because they expected to die, and many of them did. But they felt it was their duty as followers of Jesus Christ to care for the sick and dying, to minister to them in their need, to treat the bodies of the dead with great dignity and to give them a proper burial. Many of them died, but interestingly, and this wasn't the goal, but interestingly, because the sick received a basic level of medical care from these Christians who were staying to look after them, their overall survivability rates were increased. And many of them joined the church because they wanted to worship the God of these people who had cared for them in their darkest hour.
Yeah, so Christians participate in God's global history at a local level, and at the same time, God's global history happens to us. And so that's why really you can't really be alarmed by the existence of Christian civilization, particularly that software, because it kind of happened outside of our control, and if it continues, it'll be outside of our control, or if it changes or modifies, it's a theme that occurred because lots of people were behaving as Christians, and so that changed civilization. So in a way, you can't really be alarmed because it magnifies all these individual decisions and all these individual behaviors at a larger level. And of course, it magnifies human sinfulness as well at the same time. So the brokenness and the corruptionness of humanity gets magnified along with, the good things. And so you get this kind of blend of humanness of Christians attempting to be Christian. So it gets magnified. So it's not just Christians behaving as Christians causes Christian civilization to be Christian, but also the Christians attempting to be Christians gets magnified and occurs at a larger level. Okay, so that's why not to be alarmed at that level, on that point. But Kingsnorth's critique, I think, where it has merit, is the danger of imperializing Christianity. Now, just on that imperialization, there's a sense in which sometimes imperialization, I guess I'm using pejoratively, is an extreme form of institutionalization. So Paul van der Klee the other Paul, he says that, you know, you can have a movement, and individuals kind of create adopt an idea and spread an idea, and you kind of get this movement. But if you want the movement, and I'm paraphrasing Paul's point here, but if you want the movement to last, if you want there to be a sustaining value to the good thing you've discovered, then you institutionalize it. But then, of course, the sort of extreme version of institutionalization is imperialization. You keep taking this good idea and, in a way, create this system to impose this good idea or weaponize this good idea. So you can't really escape. If something's good and you want to keep doing it, you, in a way, institutionalize it. But then that can then become, as Kingsnorth points out, a problem. That the thing that's institutionalized is now imperialized. It's no longer about being part of a larger good thing, God's kingdom. You're now seeking to leverage, weaponize what was Christian values and Christianity a good thing. And I think this, to put it now in sort of my terms at the end of this video, I would sort of say imperialization occurs at a local level. So you could observe it sort of at larger scales, and some of these illustrations will be at slightly larger scales, but I think the problem is tackled and thought about, and the warning is valid at an individual, personal, local level. At the larger scale, simply because we're not the authors of the plotline, and we're not the authors of the themes, we're not the authors of the software, in some sense, the themes, the plotline happen to us. But I think as individuals, we can take on the critique, take on the warning. So I break down this imperialization. What do I mean by why am I saying it pejoratively? When a pejorative sense, I think it means three things. So I'm going to, of course, begin again. So I'm in my fourth video on the channel, two of which have included references to the Internet of Beefs. So this is the second reference to the Internet of Beefs. Picture there, link again in the show notes below. And the first way in which we imperialize Christianity, this is the danger of Christian civilization that Kingsnorth is talking about, that's worth paying attention to, and it's all worth paying attention to, but worth taking away and doing something about. And that's sort of discourse warfare. That's what the Internet of Beefs, that side, put it up that side. The Internet of Beefs is about. So there's this sort of fourth generational, although that term can also include offline stuff as well, but the sort of fourth generational warfare of the discourse that we have online. And so Christianity can be used for your discursive purposes, and you can use it to win little skirmishes, to signal, to organize, basically to win at discourse warfare. I think the second way we can imperialize Christianity, the danger of Christian civilization is imperialization. The second part of this imperialization is commercial grift. So commercial grift, and that is, and I'm going to post a clip from Kanye West. So he had a sort of a Christian phase, and for a moment there, a lot of people were really excited. Was this some sort of a signal of a wider cultural shift? But it was just kind of a phase, and the publicity surrounding it turned out to be more of a grift. It turned out to be that there wasn't a sort of deeper change. There wasn't a, and perhaps Kanye West's story is not played out completely, and maybe he'll repent and return to Christianity, and or maybe it was never a. I'm not his pastor. If he, I presume he had a pastor, and attended a church, and so in a way I can't judge him personally, but looking at the sort of trajectory of his story, it seemed like this album was using Christian ideas and Christian themes and tropes commercially. So that's what I mean by commercial grift. So I'll just play a little clip to kind of illustrate that. And then lastly, I think the other danger of imperialization is prosperity propaganda. Now, just to steelman the prosperity doctrine, I'll play a clip below, and so that you can get a sense of what those who believe in prosperity doctrine mean by it and how they might defend it. And so I'll play that now.
But all the while, they are coming against prosperity. So the question I want to ask is that who do they give credit to for their own success and prosperity? Who, to whom, or to what do they give prosperity? To themselves, to their smarts? No, God wants to get all the glory.
Right.
Remember, it is the Lord God who gives you power to get wealth. So if you say that you're against the God prospering people, then how do you explain your prosperity? Who do you give glory to for your prosperity? Your own intellect, your own prowess, your financial acumen? Because you give glory to someone.
Wow.
So, Joseph, I just want to make a note. That was pretty direct, what you just said, and I think
it's a good old Singaporean way.
Right.
Well, I'm just saying, most of the time I think of Joseph Prince as one of the kindest, gentlest, meekest
being
people.
kind and gentle?
But you're really, that means something to you. This misdirection of one of the atoning works of the cross, you got a little fired up on that. This is an issue to you, isn't it?
Yeah, the reason being because of this teachings, so-called teachings against prosperity that has caused a lot of people to shun it altogether. And as a result, their faith is not reaching out to God to even believe for that aspect of their lives. They're so afraid. Pastors are intimidated from preaching this message, lest they be lumped among the prosperity preachers. And like I said, we are all against the abuse, but to negate the whole teaching of prosperity that God is restoring in these last days, just like in times past, during the times of Martin Luther. He didn't understand about the gifts of the Holy Spirit. He didn't touch on the gifts of the Holy Spirit, but the Lord restored the baptism of the Holy Spirit in our day and age. And then God is restoring the teaching of prosperity. And if God doesn't want us to prosper, then why did Jesus become poor at the cross? Yeah. Why did Jesus say things like, seek you first the kingdom of God, and all these things will be taken away from you? Why did he say, instead of that, he says, all these things will be added unto you. So I think that the reason I feel passionately about it is because I see a lot of pastors and leaders being intimidated, all right, from preaching the true gospel. Now, the gospel produces prosperity, but the gospel is not prosperity. It's a gospel of grace and peace.
And you can see there the emphasis is on cashing in on the blessings of Christianity now. So you don't want to come right out and say you'll get, and some, I mean, they don't in this video, but they get close to it. But there's other, and I couldn't be bothered finding the videos, but you dig around, you can find videos of prosperity preachers saying that you can, by giving money to the particular preacher or ministry, you can then receive money. You'll get wealthy. There's a direct correlation there with your material circumstances. They sort of phrase it more, they make blessings a wider concept, spiritual, emotional. And that's kind of what I'm getting at here with the prosperity propaganda. That's this way in which we can say, if you adopt Christianity, then your life will be better. Your marriage will be better. Your job will be better. You'll get these various benefits. and spoiler alert, it may not. It may be a difficult path because, and I'll just throw up a cover here from Luc Ferry, as a philosopher, French philosopher, a fantastic book, and he defines philosophy as the way we live in relation to death, and religion as how to survive death. Deserves its own video at some point, but if religion is about, if the whole point of religion is to survive death, and religion should include a philosophical element of how to live now, absolutely, but the how to live now might be, well, how to survive bad things, because one day you will face judgment and be resurrected. And so prosperity propaganda leverages the Christian values to say, well, you can adopt Christian values now, emphasize the philosophical aspect, not the religious aspect, the survival of death aspect, and say, look, elect this Christian politician, do this Christian public behavior, and you will then benefit in this life, before eternity, before resurrection. So just to recap, imperialization, the danger of imperialization, the merit of Kingsnorth's critique is in being aware of the way in which Christianity can be leveraged for discourse warfare, particularly online discourse warfare, for commercial grift, and as prosperity propaganda, and that's worth paying attention to. But overall, because you might observe all of those things scaled up, and you might those three things that I've just outlined might not be personal problems for you yourself, but so there's a way in which you can kind of be alert but not alarmed. So even with those three things I've just outlined, if you start getting alarmed about them and at a larger scale, at a sort of civilization scale, there's not much you can do, because again, the plot line happens to us. God's global history is authored by God. It happens to us, and we get to participate, but only at a local level. There's perhaps another video worth making, or a tangent worth making. My thoughts aren't clear enough about it, about the place of activism, because I think that's got both dangers and merits to that. The place and the role of activism. So if you think Caesar was killed by a bunch of activists, but a bunch of activists entered the slave trade, so you can kind of go, the Cultural Revolution, the revolution, and then the Cultural Revolution in China, that's a bunch of activists, and it doesn't have the consequences aren't great. Activism, I'm not quite sure what to make of it, and that's possibly a way, a counter-argument to what I'm saying is a way in which you as an individual can participate in a larger scale than personally in the plot line. So that, I'm not quite sure how far or what to do with that counter-argument. And so I think, just segueing back from that counter-argument back to ending this comment on Kingsnorth's video, I think we, the slogan, the response is alert but not alarmed. And if we're going to move the dial, either positively to respond to these things or observe them, we do it at an ordinary level in our ordinary Christian lives, because that's the way in which the author has set up our involvement in the global history, is by this local participation. Anyway, love to hear your thoughts or see your thoughts in the comments.